The war with Japan. Our story opens in the year 1945, in July, when the Allied leaders assembled at Potsdam, Berlin, following the collapse of the Nazi power in Germany, called upon the Japanese government to surrender unconditionally. Prime Minister Suzuki tossed the demand aside as not worth consideration. The 2 atomic bombs were then dropped upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August the 6th and 9th, 1945. Japan promptly surrendered next day. General MacArthur, whose headquarters were then at Manila in the Philippines, was charged with the task of coordinating the peaceful entry of Allied forces into Japan. His first job was to find some means of talking to the Japs, so he ordered them to open a radio station and speak to us on a given wavelength in plain English from Japan down here to Manila. And by means of these long-range polemics during August 1945, the first details of surrender were arranged. The Japs were ordered to fly in 2 of their own planes painted white with green crosses so that our anti-aircraft gunners would see them, and they had to fly first of all for 1,000 miles southwards from Japan to the little island of Ishima, close by Okinawa. Here is Ishima coming into view with its little conical-shaped volcano. And when their delegation arrived here, an American Douglas Skymaster plane flew northwards for 1,000 miles from the Japs and bring them down to us, waiting at Nichols Airfield just outside Manila. They were flown over Okinawa close by, where they could see something of the might of our air forces arising as many airstrips were being built to take the war to Japan, and so in due course, on this historic Sunday evening of August the 19th, 1945, the Douglas Skymaster plane arrives at Nichols Airfield with the Japanese delegates on board who've been summoned to MacArthur's headquarters. An American staff officer boards the plane to identify them, and then, illuminated by the flashlights used by the photographers, we see the Japs descending the gangway. They are brought forward to General Willoughby, who is head of MacArthur's intelligence. Their reception was quite formal, even frosty. There were no handshakes. They were simply led to a line of waiting automobiles and driven to their quarters overlooking Manila Bay, where they could see the might of our navies preparing to take the war to Japan if she did not surrender. They're all carrying briefcases in which are details of airports, harbors, docks, and so on, which MacArthur had called for by radio to facilitate this peaceful entry into their country. After a short rest in their quarters, they were taken to the City Hall, Manila, for a first conference, with representatives of General MacArthur's headquarters and some from Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten's front in Southeast Asia. Here are the British, Australian, and American representatives arising. General Kenny, General MacArthur, and here comes General Willoughby with these half-pint warriors themselves. All these guards, by the way, were specially chosen, every man 6'2", to make the Japs realize what diminutive creatures they really are. After the conference, they were flown back to Ishima, where they picked up their own plane for Tokyo. So while we are waiting to move into Japan, let's take a look around Manila Bay, where you see something of the wrecks of 123 Jap ships sunk by United States Navy air power in the softening up of Luzon, the northern island of the Philippines, preparatory to the retaking of Manila early in 1945. This is HMAS Shropshire, England's gift cruiser to the Royal Australian Navy, a small but gallant navy which played a most effective role with General MacArthur's 7th United States Fleet throughout the Southwest Pacific Area operations. We are going to pay a visit to the world's biggest battleship, the American battleship New Jersey, as long as the liner Queen Elizabeth, and weighing about 58,000 tons, although officially the lady doesn't own up to more than about 45,000 tons. To the landsman like myself, who'd spent a great deal of time in cruisers, destroyers, and smaller fry, the sight of this immense superstructure and the 16-inch gun turrets was very impressive. We'll go on board and take a look round. America had 4 of these giant battleships in commission by the close of the war: the New Jersey, the Iowa, the Wisconsin, and the Missouri, and many more laid down which would have been completed had the war continued into 1946 and 1947. She calls all her battleships after the states of the Union, and as there are 48 states in America, they may each receive one in turn. The aircraft carriers are called after famous places in American battle history. The cruisers are called after cities. The destroyers after admirals and famous fighting captains. And the command and transport ships are called after mountain ranges in America. But it's when we go up on the bridge and take a look forward towards the bow, looking over the 16-inch gun turrets, that we get an impression of the immense length and graceful lines of these modern battleships. And here is the secondary armament, specially strengthened for dealing with suicide pilots, of whom we were to meet large numbers in the Okinawa campaign. Towards the end of August 1945, General MacArthur fulfills his final public engagement in the Philippines before leaving for Japan. He receives the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws at the Santo Tomas University, Manila. We see the famous general arriving to be received by the academic faculty, and a colorful procession is formed from here as it strolls down to the gymnasium where the ceremony of presenting him with his cap and cape take place. It was here that the Japanese interned over 3,000 civilians, men, women, and children, British, American, Australian, Dutch, and others from all over the Philippines, and we learnt intended to massacre them. But here came General Chase, commanding the 1st American Cavalry Division. With 50 tanks and 500 men, he raced 3 days ahead of the main American army. With all the bridges blown up behind him and 30,000 Japs in front of him, he succeeded in holding the Japanese army off for 3 days until the main American army arrived, and thus succeeded in saving the lives of all those 3,000 civilians. Santo Tomas is a very famous university, going back to early Spanish days over 400 years ago. But thanks to this gallant effort of General Chase and the cavalrymen, it will go down into history still more famous when the story of these days comes to be set down. We see General MacArthur at the end of the column with President Osmania, then the President of the Philippines Commonwealth, its first president. He was the man who entered Leyte in October 1944 when we first landed with General MacArthur, and who with General MacArthur helped to liberate the first province of the Philippines Commonwealth from Japanese rule. And now comes a rather important date in the story, August the 28th, 1945. On this day, the war correspondents fly northwards for 1,000 miles from Manila to Okinawa, now coming into view through the pilot's cockpit window. Okinawa, some 360 miles south of Japan, though still 1,000 miles south of Tokyo. Okinawa was intended to play the same role for us which England played in relation to Europe. For England, in that great war with Germany, became nothing but a great anchored aircraft carrier off the coast of the continent of Europe. HMS Unsinkable, she might well indeed have been termed. For from her broad, clear decks arose all the avenging hosts of the Allied bombers to destroy the German war potential, to soften up the Normandy beaches for the final invasion. So too, Okinawa was to play this role for us. Here was fought the longest of all the Pacific Island campaigns. It opened on April the 1st, 1945, and lasted 82 days. It cost the Japanese 130,000 dead, practically the whole garrison perished. It cost the Americans 12,000 lives, of whom 5,000 fell alone in the United States Navy, to the suicide pilots, as they dived into these stationary ships in the harbor, as the ships were succoring and supplying the armies ashore. But hard on the heels of the victory in June 1945, 50,000 constructional battalion men, known as Seabees, landed here to carve 30 of these gleaming coral airstrips. Here General Doolittle ran up the flag for the 8th Strategic Air Force of the United States. Here the Royal Air Force Bomber Command was to assemble, and the Royal Australian Air Force. And from here Japan was to be pounded in succeeding months for the invasion of November the 1st. The war correspondents have landed on August the 28th, and next day comes General MacArthur, flying in his own Skymaster, appropriately named Bataan, after the great fortress in the Philippines, where he first met the Japanese treachery in December 1941. The great general descending, to be received by General Kenny, commanding the Far Eastern Air Forces, that is the shorter general on the right, and on the left the taller one, General Eichelberger, commanding the 8th American Army in the Southwest Pacific area. It's been decided that we shall land in Japan next day, August the 30th, which became known throughout the world as VJ Day. But as we're not quite sure how far the Emperor's writ to surrender will run, or how far there'll be treachery, such as we have met it in all the islands of the Pacific, it's been decided to take no chances. We are going to land in Japan just as if we had to shoot our way in, and just as we have staged all the 64 amphibious landings throughout the 3.5 years of the war. 15,000 men of the American 11th Airborne Division will land in Japan the next morning, while United States Marines and 400 men of the Royal Marines of the British Pacific Fleet will dash ashore at the same time to link up with the airborne troops, while overhead will be 1,500 planes from the American Fast Carrier Force. Indeed, already the day before this, 150 men of the United States Army Air Corps have landed in Japan to prepare the airfield and the ground organization. One of their planes unfortunately crashed here at the takeoff. You can see the wreckage still burning, and all the 20 or more men on board were killed. It was a very serious loss out of 150 hand-picked specialists, but it was our only accident. And so we come to the historic VJ Day itself, August the 30th, 1945. On this morning, 15,000 men of the 11th Airborne Division, with the war correspondents, fly northwards for 1,000 miles from Okinawa to Japan. We had lined up at the airstrips at 6 o'clock the previous evening at Okinawa. It took till 2 the next morning for all 15,000 of us to be placed aboard our planes. First takeoff was at 2:30, and by 8 in the morning we see the coastline of Japan coming into view. General MacArthur had mobilized some 250 of these airliners from all over Japan for this job, from all over the Pacific, in fact. All the normal airlines were generally halted. Many an American pilot flying what he called the normal milk run of 2,400 miles from San Francisco to Honolulu, who told his wife he'd be home for dinner next night as usual, suddenly found himself whisked away to these strange waters, and he couldn't even communicate with his family for 10 days. That was inevitable in the marshalling of sufficient planes for this great job. Over the coastline we see mighty Fujiyama, rising to 13,000 feet to dominate the landscape. Not yet snowbound, for this is still the climbing season. And below lies Yokohama, very much battered about, and the 44 miles of industrial area between Yokohama and Tokyo equally flattened. We are going to land at the airfield of Atsugi, which lies about 20 miles from Yokohama. At that Manila conference, the Japs had told us that the damage done by the American superfortresses from the distant Mariana Islands, 1,500 miles south of Japan, was so accurate and immense that all the airfields round Tokyo and Yokohama were unserviceable, with the exception of this field at Atsugi. It's only about 3,500 feet long. It's only half the length of the airstrips built for the American and Australian pilots throughout the Pacific War. The Japs never possessed the four-motored bombers or the four-motored transport planes which we used. They never possessed the bulldozers, the graders, the tractors, the rollers, all that modern equipment with which America went to war, and with which we carved great 7,000-foot runways out of virgin jungle, and tore down hundreds of coconut palm trees on Pacific isles and atolls to build these immense runways. Our pilots are therefore making a rather ginger approach to this half-length strip for each of these four-motored airliners is carrying 44 fully armed infantrymen. But you may imagine the feelings of all of us, particularly those of us who had been with General MacArthur throughout the 4 years of the war, on the long 6,000-mile march northwards from Australia through New Guinea and the Philippines, and with Admiral Nimitz on the Central Pacific route for 6,000 miles from Pearl Harbor to Japan, to feel that here at last was journey's end, and that we were about to set down upon the soil of Japan, our terminal. As each plane lands, it's allowed 4 minutes in which to taxi off this half-length runway, discharge its troops with their equipment, which we did by forming an endless chain, taxi back to the starting point, and take off and get out of the way because of the next plane close on its tail. 250 of these four-motored Skymasters are to converge upon this one airstrip within the 2 hours between 8 and 10 in the morning of August the 30th. And here are the first things we saw in Japan on that historic day. Dozens of little Jap fighters, in reasonably good condition, but all minus their propellers. Of course, there's nothing that looks more helpless on the ground than an aeroplane without its air screw, unless it's a jet fighter. But this was one of the precautions which General MacArthur took at that Manila conference. He ordered the Japs to have the air screws removed from all the fighters within radius of the scene of operations to avoid all risks of suicide pilots diving into our formations of unarmed transport planes. As each transport plane discharges its troops, it takes off and flies back 1,000 miles southwards to Okinawa and the other 1,000 miles southwards again to Manila to link up with the air routes across the Pacific and start a shuttle service bringing in troops and supplies to strengthen our forces here. The Japs had been ordered at that Manila conference also to provide us with about 500 vehicles and trucks to facilitate the unloading of our planes. They all turned up, but only about half of them really proved serviceable. Japan was already evidently in a very ramshackle condition. I noticed one good feature about them. The side of each vehicle lets down, which facilitates the unloading rather better than the tailboard. Meanwhile, the first flag goes up in Japan, raised by the men of the 11th Airborne Division with whom we've just flown in, raised over the dilapidated hangars at the Atsugi airfield. This fellow is one of the Japanese military police. The civil police will be seen in black uniforms, and these other men in these various colored armlets will be guides, guards, interpreters, translators, and drivers, all ordered to be here to help us with this invasion. They all turned up quite cheerfully, ready to do a day's work for 2 cigarettes each, so they got 1 cigarette each and a kick in the pants and did a good day's work just the same. Here, too, we shall see the first of our prisoners of war coming into our lines. Once the war ended, we began to parachute supplies and troops to them far into the interior of Japan. Many of them broke out of the prisons, locked up the Japs, ran the prisons, and ran the towns. Others began to tramp through the countryside here to Tokyo and Yokohama. They are being interviewed by American and Australian war correspondents. They were then placed aboard those empty airliners, and 48 hours later they were in lovely sunny hospitals in beautiful Hawaii, 6,000 miles away, forgetting their horrible treatment at the hands of the Japs. Our first task is to build our perimeter defenses round the airfield, link up with the Navy forces which have landed, and the Marines, and guard our line of supply against treachery through the first night. We're not yet strong enough to take Yokohama and Tokyo and hold the 44 miles of country in between, so it was decided at the Manila conference to take Yokohama first, since the Navy desired to develop the port. So let's go into Yokohama with some of the men of the 11th Airborne Division and see what there is to be seen. It's a 20-mile drive through rocky country roads, as these men, all booted and spared, rumble along in their vehicles to seize the town. All along the country roads, we noticed Japanese sentries were posted. They got their backs to us, and the American troops thought at first that this was a deliberate act of discourtesy. But it wasn't that. This was one of the arrangements made at the Manila conference that they should guard our route into Yokohama. Their job is to guard all the little lanes leading off the main road, to guard the bridges, to guard the rice paddy fields from where the crops are not yet gathered and from where sniping fire might emerge, to watch the railway lines, for the trains run from Tokyo to Yokohama just across those rice fields, and there they might be sniping. And as you see, they're doing their job like good soldiers. They don't bat an eyelid. This speaks volumes for the wisdom, the sagacity, the restraint exercised by General MacArthur, for we were entirely dependent upon the goodwill and good faith of the Japs to carry out this invasion peacefully. Unlike Germany, we were not closing round the capital at the close of the war. We were still 1,000 miles from Tokyo at Okinawa. Our GHQ was 2,000 miles south of Tokyo at Manila. Our nearest troops and marines were at Iwo Jima, 750 miles south of Tokyo. Yet despite these disabilities, the whole of the occupation went off smoothly without a casualty to the Allied side. It's easy to see how we could have been ambushed from this very close country if it had not been so. Here too we were to see the first Japanese girl we were to encounter, so most of the people kept indoors very ashamed and very frightened. As we entered Yokohama, we were surprised to see the trains still running every half hour from Yokohama to Tokyo, while all around is desolation. Half the city destroyed, all the 44 miles of industrial area between Yokohama and Tokyo flattened, the trams burnt out and rusty. Yet nowhere did we see any signs of bomb craters, such as one was familiar with in England or in Germany. This is because of the bombing policy pursued. Instead of using the great blockbusters, such as were required in Germany for reducing modern cities, we developed the petroleum jelly bomb, which, when thrown down on Japanese flimsy wooden cities, burnt out the war factories, overwhelmed the firefighting services, that left all the communications of roads, railways, bridges intact for us to inherit. It proved the right policy, having regard to the type of property we had to destroy. And so we come to the first Sunday in September 1945, Sunday, September the 2nd, anniversary of the outbreak of the war on Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939. On this Sunday, the whole Japanese Empire surrenders to the Allied powers in a colorful ceremony aboard this battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. On this morning, 3 destroyers went out to the battleship. The first carried the war correspondents and specially invited guests. The second brought out the admirals and generals who were to sign the surrender. And the third brought out Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Central Pacific Area, and General MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the Southwest Pacific Area. The ceremony itself took place on a small deck within the shadow of some 16-inch guns, on a small deck known as the veranda deck, just forward of the quarter deck. And in this little arena, no larger than a boxing ring, the stage is being set. On the bulkhead you can see the Stars and Stripes framed. That is the actual flag which Commodore Perry of the United States Navy took to Japan in the 1850s when he ordered the country to be opened up to Western trade. Up to that point, the Japanese had massacred most of the Christians and closed the country to the civilized world. Delegates from all the Allied powers are coming on board, and as it's a Sunday morning, the chaplain opens the proceedings with prayer. While climbing into the overcast, we see something of the air strength which is going up there to keep a weather eye open for suicide pilots, thoughts of whom were in our minds all morning. The sky is 10/10 covered with cloud, ideal for such attempts. On the little veranda deck, Admiral Halsey is facing us, and it soon indeed became an animated scene, something like a club lounge, as American, Australian, British, Dutch, French, and other generals, admirals, and leaders foregathered to exchange yarns over old times and stirring days spent together in many a campaign. Britain is worthily represented by that table which has come from HMS King George V, flagship of the British Pacific Fleet. The American Navy doesn't carry large tables in the wardrooms, and a large table was thought essential to the dignity of the occasion. Upon it are being laid out the documents of surrender, 1 copy in Japanese, 1 copy in English. We had the largest news coverage for this surrender than of any of the other similar ceremonies of the war. Something like 350 war correspondents, newsreel cameramen, publishers, and radio commentators were gathered here. Here is a lineup of some of the delegates, the Russians, and beyond them the Chinese, while an American staff officer will show the leader of each delegate exactly where he is to stand in front of the microphone when the ceremony begins. It is due to commence at 9 o'clock in the morning local time in Japan, which was 1 o'clock in the morning GMT. So many people in Britain stayed up to listen to it, and also in the United States and Australia. On the left you will see the French with the gold bands on their caps, and next is Colonel Cosgrove from Canada with the scarlet band round his cap, and here comes Admiral Helfrich of the Netherlands East Indies with the white-topped cap, being greeted by Commodore Collins of the Royal Australian Navy. Royal Australian Air Force officers can be seen in those dark blue uniforms. Britain is represented by Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser of the British Pacific Fleet. The British Pacific Fleet was only formed early in 1945, following its arduous work in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the North Sea, and therefore the only campaign in which it took part was at Okinawa from April to June 1945, when it stood on the flank of Admiral Nimitz's Pacific Fleet and acquitted itself very worthily, especially when some British aircraft carriers took Japanese suicide pilots into their armoured decks and were able to put the fighters back in the air within 15 minutes, a fact which won warm signals of congratulation from Admiral Nimitz and Admiral Halsey. But the British Pacific Fleet was poised to play a still bigger role in Malaya in September 1945, and also in the operations in Japan in November if the war had not ended in August. The British Pacific Fleet have turned up dressed as if they were going to a tennis party, since they were told by the Americans the dress was to be quite informal. Here's a lineup of the delegates. On the extreme right of the line, that is the left of the line as we are looking at it, Admiral Nimitz will stand representing the United States, and next to him the General from China, and then Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, and then the Russian General, and then General Sir Thomas Blamey from Australia with his hands on his Sam Brown belt, and next to him Colonel Cosgrove from Canada, the General Leclerc for France, Admiral Helfrich for the Netherlands East Indies, and finally Air Commodore Izard for New Zealand. The time is now about 9:15. We are waiting for Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur. Here they come. They're going to the Admiral's cabin for 15 minutes until the ceremonial is due to commence. So now all our distinguished guests and visitors are on board, forming three sides of a square no larger than a modern boxing ring, as we await some of the principal characters in the drama, the Nips. Here they come. The Japanese foreign minister has a wooden leg, due to a bomb having been thrown at him by a Korean youth some 10 years earlier, while on his flank stands the chief of the Japanese Imperial General Staff, and all the other Nips brought to the point of execution behind him. These Japanese Foreign Office officials, in their silk hats which hadn't seen an iron for about 10 years, and their ill-fitting morning coats, and their immobile features, reminded one of nothing so much as a set of waxworks figures. Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur will now emerge from the Admiral's cabin and will approach the table. Admiral Nimitz to take up his place on the right of the line, and General MacArthur to take charge of the proceedings. He commences his speech, which is broadcast to the world, by recalling the Japanese treachery at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese Navy airmen, without warning and without declaration of war, struck that blow at the United States Pacific Fleet, and the way in which the Japanese so rapidly exploited the surprise inherent in the treachery and sprawled far and wide across the Pacific, while the Allies were so badly stretched in Africa and Europe through the first 9 months of the war. He then recalls the way in which production throughout America, Australia, and other countries got into its stride as we developed the technique of carrying the war from island to island across the Pacific, until finally we are standing circling Japan. And then he calls upon the Japanese foreign minister to approach the table first, and in the name of the Emperor of Japan and of the Japanese government, to sign the terms of unconditional surrender, and to permit an Allied army to occupy the soil of Japan for the first time in the 2,600 years of her history. And following him, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff is compelled to sign, for too often in the past, The Japanese army has usurped the civil power and repudiated things done in its name. They formed a movement which they call the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, ostensibly a patriotic body to support the emperor, actually a political party under army control. If any member of the Japanese Diet didn't join it, it looked as if he were disloyal to the emperor, which was unthinkable. If he did join it, he fell under army control, who then assassinated opponents, muzzled the Diet, and ran the whole country. And now, one by one, the delegates will come forward to sign. But ere they do so, one of the unrehearsed incidents of the morning takes place. General MacArthur calls to the microphone General Wainwright from Corregidor in the Philippines, and General Percival, the British general from Singapore, those two leaders who had first borne the brunt and fury of the Japanese invasion, and who had suffered so much at their hands. And he presents them with the first two pens with which the surrender is signed. This is the first of many retributive acts of justice for them in the presence of their enemies. Admiral Nimitz comes forward to sign on behalf of the United States. You'll notice he doesn't trust these army pens, he pulls out his own. As each leader signs, he calls to the microphone those leaders who have borne the heat and burden of responsibility with him throughout the long years of the war. Following the Chinese general comes Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, who calls to the microphone Admiral Sir Bertram Rawlings and Admiral Sir Patrick Brind, both of the British Pacific Fleet. The Russian general comes next. A number of extra photographers were posted round the table photographed. And following him comes General Sir Thomas Blamey from Australia. And now the Japs see for the first time the man whose Australian forces drove them back over the Owen Stanley Mountains of New Guinea, who won the first land victories in the Southwest Pacific area, who saved Australia from invasion, and who taught the Allies their first lessons in jungle warfare. And so on down the line it goes. I haven't got them all signing because I'm changing reels at one or two points, and this pinking you see is fog or light leaking into the camera, which is rather old after its long years of the campaigns. But Colonel Cosgrove follows for Canada, and then General Leclerc for France, and now Admiral Helfrich for the Netherlands East Indies, and finally Air Commodore Izard, who signs for gallant little New Zealand. General MacArthur winds up the ceremonial with another short speech, and then there occurs another of these unrehearsed incidents of the day. Just as General Sutherland, his chief of staff, approaches the table to blot the copies and hand them over, he notices to his dismay that Colonel Cosgrave, who signed for Canada, has inadvertently skipped a line and signed on the wrong line. And of course that's thrown everybody else out. So as you can see, there's a historic conference going on round the table to decide what to do about it. Obviously they can't cross out the name of each signatory, so they cross out the name of each country and put it opposite the signature as the best way out. So Colonel Cosgrave goes down into history like a famous Bateman cartoon of the British guardsman who dropped his rifle on parade. Meanwhile, the Japs are having a private argument about it because they've been given the mutilated copy. They're not quite sure whether they've really been given the goods. And now, just as the ceremonial ends, with beautiful timing, we see something of the tremendous aerial strength which all this time, out of sight and out of sound, has been high above the overcast, keeping a weather eye open for suicide pilots. Some 1,500 planes are in the air this morning, 750 provided by the Army Air Corps, 750 by the Navy carriers. And just as the Japs are leaving the deck of Missouri with downcast faces and solemn step, they see something of this tremendous air might which we built up in the Pacific and which has been one of the principal causes of their defection. With beautiful timing, they swept right down over the decks just as the ceremonial ended. And now let's take a look at one or two of the celebrities who were present this day. First we shall see General Walter Kruger, who commanded the American Sixth Army under MacArthur throughout the Pacific War, who joined the American Army as a private soldier, who served 50 years, rose to be a full general, and was much beloved of all his men. And with him is General Stilwell from China, known to his troops as Vinegar Joe, and General Marquette, who built up our anti-aircraft artillery defenses throughout the Southwest Pacific. and the Russians who wanted to be photographed specially round the conference table as a memento of the occasion. General Valdez of the Philippines. The ship itself has quite a proud record, as you see from those symbols of aircraft and ships brought down. Admiral McCain, who unfortunately was to die of heart failure a few days later when he returned to the Californian coast. And a great many other American admirals and generals whom one got to know quite intimately during the long years of the war together in many a stirring action. Here are the Russians round the conference table. The French under General Leclerc, General Sir Thomas Blavey with the Australian leaders. He had one great record. He was the only commander-in-chief on any side in the war who was commander-in-chief of his men when the war began in September 1939 and still commander-in-chief when it ended with Japan in August 45. On the left is Commodore Collins, who since became Australia's first admiral, badly wounded in the first Battle of the Philippines at Leyte, but happily recovered. In the background is Air Vice Marshal Jones, Chief of the Air Staff during the war. And General Berryman, also in the group. General Leclerc on the left, who led his forces so gallantly from Lake Chad to Montgomery's flank in the North Africa campaign. Another view of the Australian leaders. General Percival from Singapore, who's just going off to Manila to see his old enemy Yamashita. Admiral Halsey, the Lion of the Pacific. This was his great day out. America's most gallant admiral throughout the war. General Willoughby, head of our intelligence, speaking in French to General Leclerc. Admiral Nimitz escorts General MacArthur to the destroyer which will take him back to Yokohama. We've not yet gone into Tokyo, partly for reasons of protocol until the surrender is signed, partly we're not strong enough. But every day we're going stronger, thanks to the air shuttle service from Manila and Okinawa, and through the Navy bringing in supplies at Yokohama. General Willoughby is now speaking to the Russians in their own language. He speaks several of these European tongues. General Thorpe on the left, head of our counterintelligence at Tokyo with General Fitch. And this first reel comes to an end with this view of General Eichelberger commanding the 8th American Army, surrounded by some of the high Allied leaders who were present on this very auspicious day. Move into Tokyo. And on the road to Tokyo from Yokohama, at a rather strategic point beside a bridge, where all who pass must read it, this sign has been erected by the United States 1st Cavalry Division. You may read it for yourselves. One or two of the other American divisions were not very happy about this sign, so the cavalry have to keep a guard over it. On the way into Tokyo, we passed the first of many Shinto shrines, or rather this is the torii, or gateway to the shrine. If we glance through it, we will see the heavily ornate shrine in the distance. Most Japs are Shintoists by religion. That is, they believe the emperor is veritably God, but they are descended from gods. They worship their ancestors and believe they must appear before the court of their ancestors when they die. These are typical suburban roads running into Tokyo for a distance of about 12 miles out. They give you a first impression of the damage done to Tokyo by the petroleum jelly bombs. These routes for about 12 miles from the suburbs into the heart of the city may be compared with similar drives into any cities in England, particularly into London, where there was quite severe damage, and nowhere would we see anywhere in England at that time damage comparable to what was to be seen in Tokyo or other Japanese cities. I took these pictures actually in December 1945, not in September when we first moved in, and a certain number of wooden huts had been built in the intervening months, largely for retail trade for the people still living here. Otherwise, there's a great vista of destruction with heavy concentrated damage in vast areas of the city, where the petroleum jelly bombs have overwhelmed the firefighting services and burnt out vast areas of flimsy wooden structures, including war material which we found was dispersed in the homes of the people, while modern concrete buildings, which would have required blockbusters and heavy explosive bombs, have to some extent survived. These are all main roads, bus routes and tram routes, leading for about 12 miles or more into the city centre, where you see an endless vista of destruction if it were not for many of these wooden structures which have been built soon after the occupation. On studying the damage in Tokyo, we discovered that quite 60% of the city had been destroyed. And this was true of all the other cities and towns of Japan. 60% of them had been destroyed by the petroleum jelly bombs dropped from the B-29s or super fortresses operating from the Mariana Islands 1,500 miles south of Japan, involving a 3,000-mile round trip for each bombing operation. It was in the beginning of September 1945 also that General MacArthur made his formal entry into Tokyo. Quite a small, restrained, dignified ceremonial which took place at the United States Embassy. The United States 1st Cavalry Division performed all the guards of honor throughout Japan. We see here General Chase, its commander at this time, who so gallantly led his men into every action personally throughout the war, from the Admiralty Islands right up through the Philippines to Japan, and who rescued all those civilians at the Santo Tomas University. General MacArthur arrives with Admiral Halsey to be received by General Chase. The American 1st Cavalry Division is their only regular cavalry. Its battle honors go all the way back to the early days of Indian warfare, its battle honors being inscribed on those yellow standards in the background. The little ceremonial simply takes the form of the raising of the Stars and Stripes over the embassy. General MacArthur calls upon General Robert L. Eichelberger, commanding the 8th American Army, in whose area Tokyo is situated, to raise the flag once again after it had been hauled down nearly 4 years earlier by the Japanese. A similar ceremony took place a few days later with the Union Jack at the British Embassy. Strange to say, despite all the destruction wrought in Tokyo and wrought all round our embassies, both the British and the American embassies and the Canadian legation remained unharmed. This, of course, put up the prestige of the bomber pilots terrifically among the Japanese people. They thought the pilots could drop the bombs just where they wished, taking one building and missing another, as if they could almost drop them down the letterboxes. It's fortunate that both our embassies survived, because so many members of the American Congress and then so many members of the British House of Commons and House of Lords began to wangle trips to Japan under all sorts of pretexts so that they could see the damaged cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that fortunately there was somewhere suitable at which they could be entertained. The British Embassy stands on the best site in Tokyo, on a hill near the Emperor's Palace. Whenever the air raid warning sounded, the Japanese would tether the Imperial horses round the British Embassy buildings and disperse themselves round it as well, feeling sure it was the safest place in Japan, as indeed it proved to be. I wasn't present, unfortunately, when the ceremonial of raising the Union Jack over the British Embassy took place, but you'll see it flying, and the 9 buildings in the compound, which are all complete. Here the British Royal Marines began to mount guard with all the precision of the guards at Buckingham Palace, London. It was so well done that a crowd of admiring Americans and Japanese gathered round every day to watch it. It was Britain's one little bit of propaganda in Japan until the Allied armies arrived in April 1946. Let us leave Tokyo for a while and journey into the countryside. You will notice the women are not wearing their lovely flowered kimonos, but these siren suits or mompai suits. The trains are running regularly all over the country and quite safely, fed on hydroelectric power from the hills. But there's a great shortage of rolling stock. One sees soldiers carrying immense bundles all over the country. The people crowd the trains, sit on each other's knees, crowd the corridors, ride on the running boards, even crowd round the engine driver's footplate. But some carriages are reserved for Allied personnel. We're going to visit a pretty little village called Miyanoshita, set up in the hills on the way to Fujiyama. Fuji, the peerless mountain. Set in typical Japanese mountain scenery is this palace hotel, which was something of a honeymoon resort for Europeans before the war. Here the neutral embassy staffs were evacuated when the bombing of Tokyo grew too hot for them. Here we arrested the German and the Italian embassy staffs. Sited about 2,000 feet up in lovely Japanese mountain scenery with the typical red lacquer bridge over the pond, we shall see also the sacred carp gambling in the pond. They have one very pleasant custom at this hotel. A number of the rooms are called after flowers instead of being numbered. So on coming in at night, one picks up a key at the counter, which has a large finger plate attached with coloured flowers on it. One searches the corridors till one finds a room with a similar finger plate, and there you can sleep in a room called Jasmine, or Rose, or Cherry Blossom, or Lily of the Valley. The sacred carp, like giant goldfish, are to be found in ponds and lakes all over Japan. They eat out of your hand like the pigeons at Trafalgar Square, London. Nobody harms them. They're considered quite sacred. One day, all the war correspondents gathered round General MacArthur's headquarters at the United States Embassy in Tokyo because the Emperor Hirohito had called on MacArthur for the first time. MacArthur never called on the Emperor. But this was as near as we got. We saw his car disappearing in the distance. It was an event not lost upon the Japanese that the man whom they believed to be God should have to call on a mere mortal. It was by this method that MacArthur kept the Emperor on the throne and issued his orders to the people through the Emperor. Another time, we called on the Japanese movie studio with some of these officers of the 8th United States Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. The Japs have a very nice movie studio outside Tokyo, hotels in the city centre, and look backwards along those suburban roads down which we've travelled from Yokohama. You can see the endless vista of destruction for 12 miles to the farthest horizon, which gives a very clear idea of the way in which the petroleum jelly bombs had destroyed so much of the city. Though nearer the city centre, where the city is more modern, blockbusters would have been required to reduce these buildings, which fortunately have been spared. They're very useful for Allied personnel. And here is the moat round the Emperor's Palace, which seems to have been built in the centre of Tokyo with the modern city built round it. All these Japanese castles and palaces have these moats round them, very wide to prevent the mob from rushing across, and they're surrounded by tall granite walls with stunted trees growing on the top, such as have been made familiar in the legend of the willow pattern. Here on a warm Sunday afternoon in the autumn, for the autumn days are very sunny and consistently fine in Japan, one sees the people strolling out in the streets, forgetting their troubles now that the war is over and there's no more bombing, or feeding the sacred carp in the moat round the Emperor's Palace. There's a tram with a very significant number to tell Japan of her first invasion. One doesn't see the women yet in their lovely flowered kimonos, for in the final year of the war, when the bombing of Japan and Tokyo grew very terrible, the Emperor ordered them to remove the kimono, which spoke of happier days, and which wasn't very serviceable anyway from running into air raids. But after we have been in the country a few months, and the people have settled down, the lovely flowered kimono returns. The first port we visit is Sasebo, a place where many two-men submarines were being built and where much war material was being stored away inside the hills. In fact, we found that all these Japanese ports built among these hills, they'd been burrowing away for many years, taking advantage of their geographical features to store vast war materials. This is one of their flimsy barges in which they carried out their invasions across 6,000 miles of the Pacific. It can't even keep out a machine gun bullet, and was not to be compared for a moment with the sturdy barges built for us as we began to take the war back to them, Americans and Australians, during later years. From Sasebo we shall join an ultralight aeroplane of the Navy, an L-5, to journey to Nagasaki, the second of the two atomic-bombed cities. Down below, in a little unnamed cove of Sasebo Harbor, we see the rusting, redding remnants of the once proud and mighty Japanese Navy, now surrendered to the Allies. The Navy which for 80 years they had modelled upon the King's Royal Navy, right down to the last button on the officers' uniforms, and which they believed was going to be the spearhead of their climb to world dominion. Down over the devastated city of Nagasaki, which received its atom bomb on August the 9th, 1945. And we shall follow suit, and from only 500 feet above the stricken city, you will see the first colored films taken of this atom bomb town. Now, the bomb was not really intended for Nagasaki. It was originally intended for another city 100 miles to the north. But that city was obscured by cloud, so Nagasaki was selected as a target of last opportunity. It was dropped from a superfortress flying at 30,000 feet, a superfortress which had flown 1,500 miles from Tinian in the Mariana Islands for the task. And it was set to explode a few thousand feet above the city to give the greatest lateral effect from the explosion. Had it fallen where intended, between the Mitsubishi aircraft works, which have just been in the picture, and the sea, there can be little doubt that all of the 300,000 inhabitants of Nagasaki might have been affected. But Nagasaki is built up a valley, like so many of these Japanese ports. The bomb fell on the hills on one side, which absorbed the blast, and the older part of the city, where 200,000 people live, escaped damage. Nevertheless, the Mitsubishi aircraft works here were completely destroyed. So great was the heat generated by the bomb that these works melted like wax from a candle. Nothing was ever grown again here or elsewhere in Nagasaki after the visit from this superfortress. Survivors and eyewitnesses with whom I spoke a few days later after we entered the city told me that the first thing of which they became conscious was a strange white light in the sky, something like the magnesium flares used by photographers, but magnified many times. And then they were conscious of a strange wave of heat passing through them on the ground. And this was followed by an uncanny stillness, something like the silence that precedes an earthquake. And then they heard a tremendous rumbling noise, a great regimented noise. It was like the noise a small boy makes, running a stick along the railings, or the noise one might make passing the hand down the slats of a Venetian blind, though very much louder. It was the noise of street after street, house after house, roof after roof, collapsing under the tremendous burst of the blast released by the atomic energy. It was as though someone had passed over each street with a magic wand, and every row of houses collapsed like a pack of cards at his passing. It's difficult to imagine that one bomb dropped from one aeroplane during one visit achieved so much, and it may be contrasted with the cumulative work of many hundreds of hours of thousands of bombers flying on the long run of 3,000 miles round trip from the Marianas to Japan and back to accomplish similar destruction in other cities. Throughout the whole 12 miles of the valley, there was nothing but destruction, for hardly a house has been left standing, and certainly no works ever functioned again after the atom bomb dropped. HMS Swiftjaw is allowed into the bay. We see how the country is very hilly and volcanic, and how important it would be for a bomb to drop right in the center of the valley if the effects of the blast were to be felt equally on both sides. We shall go ashore, and from the top of the hospital roof, of which previously we had a close-up from 500 feet, we shall now secure a closer view from the ground. It's only the empty shell of the hospital that remains standing. 12 of the 16 medical professors were killed, all the doctors died, all the nurses perished, all the patients passed away. All the first, second and third year medical students died. Only the fourth year medical men remained, and only 4 of the 16 teaching professors. And they only survived because they were not sleeping in the hospital that night. Yet despite all the destruction, you can see the train in the distance is still running. The railway tracks and the signal services were not affected even by the heat. And coming into view now is a great hill completely browned off. It was just above this hill that the bomb actually exploded. It will be seen that that hill is completely brown while vegetation is to be found on the other hills in the distance. This hill received the full blast of the atomic energy. The blast itself played strange tricks, just as other kinds of blast. Where it left a chimney or the torii of a gateway, it would pass round them and leave them standing. Where it struck a great wall, it would destroy it by the impact of the blast at right angles to the wall. These are the first soldiers coming home from the conflict to find the ruins of their former homes at Nagasaki, and the first civilians returning to the scenes of their homes to find relatives or to search for their belongings, or to pick up the story of what really befell them. Yet despite all the destruction, it will be noticed that the roads are quite intact, just like the railways and the bridges. All the communications are still here untouched. Nothing hit the ground at all. There are no bomb craters. It was simply the blast from the bomb, exploding at a few thousand feet above the city, which created this tremendous amount of damage. The officers and the ratings of HMS Swiftsure are allowed ashore for a look round. They're not allowed to wander very far from the roadside, not because there's any longer at this time any danger from the gamma rays, but because of the awful stench of the dead. 40,000 people lie unburied among the rubble. Indeed, the bomb killed up to 40,000 in the first hour, and up to another 40,000 died from the effects of the mysterious gamma ray within the first 6 weeks. It seems indeed that the first thing that happens when a visitation of this nature strikes a modern city is that all the firefighting services are overwhelmed over a vast area, no matter how well they may be dispersed, and all the air raid precaution services are immobilized over a great area, no matter how faithfully they may be served. The first task is to let the dead bury the dead. The first duty is towards the living. It's to save them from pestilence. Because with 40,000 lying dead and unburied under the ruins, and with thousands more still living amid these ruins throughout the first winter of the occupation, the typhus louse would breed in such conditions, and by April of 1946, a great typhus epidemic was expected both here and at Hiroshima. It was only deflected by the heroic work of the American Army medical doctors, who lived among these people and shared their risks and discomforts throughout the first winter of the occupation. The Japs themselves did nothing at all for the people. They simply put up these notices to prevent any information of the devastation reaching the rest of Japan, to affect the morale of the people. They sealed off the cities and left them to rot on the vine with typical Oriental callousness. And had it not been for the work of the American doctors, nothing at all would have been done for all the unfortunate wretches who survived these disasters. From Nagasaki, the next port of call on this trip round Kyushu, this southern island of Japan, is Kagoshima. Kagoshima was the place which we were going to invade on the coast of Kyushu if the war had continued until November 1945 instead of ending in August. The operation, known then secretly by the code word of Operation Olympic, was intended to be staged from Okinawa, 360 miles south of here, to this port of Kagoshima, where the entrance through this narrow gap between the mountains guards the approach into the harbor. We were soon able to discover, when we went ashore here and when we visited the beaches which had been selected for the invasion, something of the reception which would have met the Allied forces had we had to shoot our way into Japan. The Japs had fully realized that these were some of the beaches which we intended to enter, and they had arranged their defenses accordingly. Here they had suicide boats, two-men submarines. Here also they were to muster the last of their 10,000 pilots and aircraft held in reserve for the invasion of Japan, and without doubt the American, the British, and the Australian forces would have met a very hot reception. The ratings of HMS Swiftsure are being issued with sidearms before they go ashore, for we are one of the first ships to arrive in this part of Japan. We're not quite sure what the reception will be like. Kagoshima is a very volcanic area. Indeed, there is a 4,000-foot volcano situated here, against which you will see Swiftshore silhouetted. Some of us tried to climb to the top, but found the going very difficult in the soft volcanic ash near the summit. Although it's only half the height of the Owen Stanley Mountains, which the Australians scaled in New Guinea in 1942, I found the going up these mountains much tougher than that effort in those earlier years of the war. As we enter the harbour, the people are running alongside the quay, just as eager to see us as we are to see them. You will notice particularly a Japanese woman carrying a small baby on her back. You will have observed in Tokyo and elsewhere that the women carry the infant on the back, leaving their arms free to carry other bundles. It has to be remembered that apart from Tokyo and Yokohama, the Japanese people had seen very little in the way of motor transport in any of these other towns, and they were in no sense traffic conscious. We're going to visit another part of Kagoshima where there are the stations and the marshalling yards, where we'll see something of the damage done. Since Japan is built on 4 islands, they are all connected up with bridges and railways, and our bombing, being strategic in its plan and pattern, aimed for the most part at destroying these connections between the islands to create bottlenecks, while the roads, the railways, the bridges have still been left intact. And here too we shall see how the residential portions of the city, with the traditional slate grey roof, that is the houses at the rear of the city, have still been left undamaged. Our bombing was all carefully planned to aim at strategic objectives. And where one sees here and there a concrete modern building still standing amid this welter of destruction, it serves but to emphasize the tremendous amount of damage done all around. The petroleum jelly bombs cascaded into these cities overwhelmed the firefighting services, set fire to these wooden flimsy properties, and the fires then their own destruction. Had the war indeed continued through August, September and October, until we were to invade Kyushu on November the 1st, 1945, there can be no doubt that all the remainder of this city and of the other cities of this island would have been completely destroyed, and Japan would have presented a picture of a country, every city of which was 100% destroyed by air power operated by remote control 1,500 miles away. On the airport one sees a great many aircraft which were still in a state of preservation and which were being saved for the museums of the Allies, while other aircraft are lying in all the agonies of death and destruction, not caused by any action on our part, but by the great typhoon which swept over Kyushu and over Okinawa 360 miles to the south at the beginning of November 1945. It was accompanied by winds of 200 miles per hour, the greatest in living memory. Mighty Fuji, the peerless mountain, towering above her surroundings and above this great cloud bank near the summit. We shall be able to approach the summit in clear visibility with a complete absence of bumps, and from only 100 feet gaze into the 500-foot crater. The Fujiyama was sacred to the Japanese. Almost unknown to them, it was almost equally sacred to the American pilots, who had to fly 1,500 miles each way from the Marianas on these bombing missions. For as they rose from the tropics in the Marianas and flew towards the temperate zone in the north, very often in bad weather as they approached the coast, all their possessions had to be sorted out here in the open. The men were not allowed to take out more than 1,000 yen or yuan, the equivalent of about 4 pounds sterling. They were not allowed to take out any precious possessions in the way of gold or diamonds or jewels or precious stones. Even their books had to be searched for hidden notes. Even the clothes of the children had to be searched for contraband. The women were not allowed to take out the equivalent of more than 2 kimonos or silk to the same extent. Everything else had to be left behind for the Koreans who had been plundered for so long. Apart from these restrictions, they could take out all their worldly possessions. And so we see them moving down to the port of Fusan, men, women, and even little children, carrying immense burdens, which would be heavy even for adult Europeans. They are moving out of Korea for the last time after an occupation lasting 44 years. In many cases they were born in Korea, treated to a dose of DDT powder, and being given a shot in the arm against typhus to prevent them carrying epidemics back into Japan as they cross the Sea of Japan from Fusan to Fukuoka. Finally, they are placed aboard these steamers, which will carry them back to their homeland. They give us the famous Banzai shout, 1,000 years of welcome, little realizing they are returning to a country which has been so thoroughly devastated by the bombers operating from the Marianas. It was so tremendous it lifted 10,000-ton steamers from the harbors at Okinawa and flung them inland. It lifted up great super fortresses and flung them off the airstrips. It destroyed every camp on Okinawa. Had indeed the intention to invade Japan on November the 1st still been necessary, our whole operation might have been set back 6 months as a result of this destruction. But fortunately we were already in Japan. Fukuoka might well be called the city of disillusion, for here the Japs are coming back from Korea, a land which has not been visited by bombers or by war damage, and here they see for the first time the damage done to their own country. In Korea they were kept ignorant of it all. Now arriving home, it unfolds like a moving picture as they travel from town to town. Here in these scenes we therefore see the need for the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. For by the year 1947 one began to notice a good deal of self-searching and moralizing in the United States as to whether it were wise or necessary to drop those 2 atomic bombs at all. You have already seen, and will indeed see in the next reel, how the destruction of the cities of Japan and of the war production was complete before the 2 atomic bombs were dropped in August 1945. They were not therefore dropped in order to wreck Japan's war potential. That task had all but been done. But Japan, like Nazi Germany, was a country which gave herself up to dictatorship. And when a country does that, and muzzles the press, and closes parliament, and poises everything on one throw of the cards, it behaves like a gambler. All its boats are burnt behind it. Everything is poised on victory. The people are kept in ignorance of the issue, and in ignorance of the forces of the war and of its fortunes. They learn only the good side. When, therefore, the inevitable showdown comes, and defeat stares them in the face, there is no way out for those who have poised everything on one throw of the cards, except the way out of the gambler who has risked his whole fortune or his home on one toss or one dice. That way is suicide, which is the way that most of the German leaders chose. The only other way is if the victors, as the hour of their victory draws near, if in their mercy they will provide a bridge by which the defeated enemy can march back to sanity, that way lies the only route to salvation otherwise. And the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs was done just for this reason, because Japan, being a nation which lives by face saving, there was no way by which the face of the government could be saved, or by which they could go to the people and tell them they had lost the war, unless the Allies provided demonstratively some method which would ensure it. This enabled the Emperor to issue his famous rescript calling on the people to surrender unconditionally on the ground that it was not now dishonorable to surrender in view of the fact that these weapons of atomic warfare had now been invented. These scenes in the streets of Fukuoka are not so very dissimilar from what one would have seen at the time in the cities of England or in Germany, of women for the most part trying to gather the threads of their lives around them, wherever a tap is running, to heat some water to make food for the children or to wash clothes, and generally trying to make the best of a bad job. While the Japanese are moving out of Korea and are crossing the Sea of Japan in steamers to this port of Fukuoka, the Koreans are being brought from the mines in Japan, where they've been working during the war, to this same port. They too are crowded into the little steamers which have brought the Japanese across that narrow stretch of waters, and they are taken back to their homeland, the only difference being that they are leaving a country which has been thoroughly blitzed by war, and are returning to their homes which have been undamaged. In November 1945, some Royal Air Force experts came out from England to survey the damage done by the petroleum jelly bombing over Japan. I was fortunate enough to be able to fly with them. We took off from an aerodrome near Tokyo one day at about 8:30 in the morning and remained in the air till about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. These are the experts who had built up the blockbusters, the tall boys, the Grand Slams, which had done all the bombing damage in Germany. We are taking off over the plains of Tokyo, which are about 50 miles wide, on which Tokyo and Yokohama stand, and we shall climb above these mountains, which rise to about 5,000 feet, guarding the approach to the Tokyo plains. In the distance, presently, we shall see mighty Fujiyama, Fuji the peerless mountain, rising to nearly 13,000 feet to dominate the landscape and to dominate and influence the lives of all the people of Japan. We are going to fly over many of the cities of Honshu. Honshu is the principal island of the 4 islands of the Japanese people. 34 million people live on Honshu, out of Japan's 70 millions. So that here we would expect to find the most cities and the most war industries. Fuji appears with its peak now gathering its first wintry mantle. This is the southern slope, up which young couples used to climb hand in hand before the war and fling themselves into the 500-foot crater at the top if their parents would not allow them to marry, for this seemed to be the only honorable way out in a land where parental disobedience was unthought of. The traffic was interrupted, of course, somewhat during the war. On our way back later in the day, we shall fly over the top of Fuji and be able to look down into the crater. We are going to visit cities like Osaka, a city of 3 million people, Nagoya, and then the ports of Kobe and Kure, and lots of other smaller places in between. And finally we shall cross the inland sea to Hiroshima, the first city in history to be struck by an atomic bomb. As we fly over each of these places, our Dakota comes down to about 1,200 feet and stays over each place for about 10 minutes to give the Royal Air Force bomb experts on board a view of the damage actually done by the petroleum jelly bombs. There is ample literature on board the airliner for each officer, giving him the name of each town we are visiting, the population, the nature of the war industries, the number of bombing raids accomplished, the weight of bombs dropped, and the places where direct hits have been secured. You too can look down upon all these scenes of destruction exactly as they appeared, untouched in those days of this war against Japan. You will see how the bomb damage has burnt out vast areas, yet leaving bridges, roads, railways, and communications generally intact. All this is self-evident. I would like, therefore, to speak to you of something which is not so self-evident from the picture, and that is the bombing strategic plan behind it all. When the Japs struck at Pearl Harbor at the United States Pacific Fleet on December the 7th, 1941, one of their motives was to spread like a great volcanic eruption far and wide across the Pacific before the United States, Britain and Australia, the Dutch and other countries affected in the Pacific could be on their feet to meet the blow on something like reasonable terms. the Japs aimed at securing a great perimeter of islands so many thousands of miles distant from their homeland that nowhere would the Allies be within bombing radius of Japan. While from inside the safety of those ramparts, they aimed at plundering the raw material of the Dutch East Indies, of Borneo and of Malaya, the rubber, the oil, the tin, the quinine, all those strategic resources valuable to both sides, which they hoped to take through the South China Seas back to Japan to build up their own war potential. In all this they were to be highly successful for the first 3 years of the war. For with the exception of the lone and gallant raid upon Tokyo by General Doolittle and his pilots, flying from the American aircraft carrier Hornet, no bombing raids were possible upon Japan until nearly 3 years after the blow upon Pearl Harbor. It was not indeed until November 1943, 2 years after the Pearl Harbor attack, that Admiral Nimitz in the South Pacific and the Central Pacific felt strong enough with the resurrected Pacific Fleet and with new production from the United States to take the initiative and close with the Japs in the British Gilbert Islands, where in the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, 1,000 American Marines perished and nearly 6,000 Japanese Marines died to the last man as the British Gilberts were restored to the Crown at the Battle of Tarawa. Admiral Nimitz then moved westwards through the Central Pacific with his fleets, marines and armies, and entered the Marshall Islands in January 1944. He took half the Marshalls. He took the half where the rain falls, and left the Japs the other half where it rarely falls. And that meant their submarines from then onwards were deflected from their proper strategic role of attacking our shipping to the succoring of all these marooned men left on these islands in our wake. In February 1944, moving still further westwards through the Central Pacific, Admiral Nimitz attacked Truk, the mighty naval base in the Carolines, and in one great blow with his naval and naval air power put the place out of business. In May, June, July and August 1944, moving northwards through the Central Pacific this time, he struck at the Marianas, at Saipan in June, at Guam in July, and Tinian in August, and took the bases which were to give us our first airstrips for the attacks upon Japan. Meanwhile, 2 years earlier, at one of those conferences between Roosevelt and Churchill and their military and naval advisors, a decision had been taken to build the superfortresses, which, with a range of 3,000 miles, a bomb load of 6 tons, with pressure cabins enabling them to fly at 30,000 feet above the Japanese anti-aircraft fire, would be able to carry the war to Japan from the Marianas 1,500 miles south of their cities. A long bow was drawn in the hope that there would be no industrial disturbance in America for the succeeding 2 years and no strategic setbacks in the Pacific. And so it came to pass that as we entered Guam in August of 1944, the first B-29s were rolling off the assembly lines in America. The first pilots and airmen were being trained to fly them. The first ground crews were being trained to handle them. The first big airstrips were not ready for the attacks on Japan till October 44, and it was really December of that year, 3 years after the Pearl Harbor blow, that the strategic bombing of Japan begins in earnest, with hundreds of superfortresses flying the round trip of 3,000 miles every night. The job had to be done at night largely, for there were no islands in our possession at which they could land during the day, or from which they could be given fighter escort. But by February 1945, Admiral Nimitz's forces have moved northwards to the island of Iwo Jima, 750 miles south of Japan, where nearly 5,000 American troops and Marines perished, and the 21,000 Japs on the island died almost to the last man. But when Iwo Jima was taken, an airstrip was ready by March 1945, from where the Mustang fighters could arise to escort the bombers coming in by day. And you have already seen how by April, May and June of 1945, Okinawa was taken, giving us our first airstrips only 360 miles south of Kyushu. Thus it wasn't until May 1945 that our bombing reached its highest intensity, with bombing from the Marianas, from Iwo Jima, and from Okinawa. It only took 3 months of that intense bombing to bring Japan by the end of July to a mood of surrender. At the ports of Kobe and Kure, we found that 4,000 Japanese troops had been on guard here for 20 years to keep the local civilians out, so that they would not know what was going on. For in between the First World War and the Second, the Japanese were taking advantage of their geographical features by burrowing into those mountains and storing vast quantities of war material, poison gas, two-man submarines, suicide boats, and all manner of munitions, in the hope that these would be safe in the hills from bombing attacks, while they themselves launched a strategic bombing policy, first against China and then against other countries. It's taking the Allied troops the first 2 years of the occupation to discover the whereabouts of these great Aladdin's caves and to cast all this war material into the sea. It is from these ports of Kobe and Kure, where visitors were allowed to land before the war, but were never allowed to take photographs, that we crossed this sunken Jap cruiser in the inland sea and journeyed to Hiroshima, the first city in history to be bombed with an atomic bomb on August the 6th, 1945. We are looking down on Hiroshima now, whose people, some 400,000 strong, had seen these smaller places being bombed day and night, and asked themselves only one question: when is it our turn? They expected to be bombed, and in the warm summer months of May, June, July, and August 1945, they would take to these hills on the outskirts of the city to sleep there, fully expecting they would be bombed at night, and they would move down at about 8 o'clock in the morning to the city to make their breakfasts. But the bomb did not fall at night. It was dropped here at 8:14 in the morning, just as the one at Nagasaki was dropped in daylight. And these two bombs were dropped in daylight for a special reason. They were the only two which America had ready at the time. And if they were to achieve their declared objectives of creating a condition in which the Japanese government could get out of the war and avoid the danger and the damage of having to shoot our way into Japan, then it was essential these bombs should fall right in the center of these cities and not accept the risk of falling wide of the targets into the sea. At 8:14 in the morning, 100,000 people were making their fires at their kerosene stoves in their little wooden homes. A blast caused by the bomb caused the walls of the houses to collapse. The heavy slate-grey roofs caved in. The stoves overturned. The houses caught fire. The people were trapped in their homes. And within a few minutes, 100,000 of them had perished. It was as though 100,000 incendiary bombs had first been dropped to carpet the way for the coming of the atomic bomb. The city is bisected in 5 places by the river, which normally might have acted as a suitable fire break. But since the fires started simultaneously all over the city, this was impossible. Here again the bomb dropped full and square over the center of the city. At a few thousand feet, nothing hit the ground. Most of the bridges, the railways, the roads, the communications are intact. But for 12 miles in every direction, the whole city has been destroyed. The damage done by one bomb, dropped from one aeroplane on one visit, can, like at Nagasaki, be contrasted with the great cumulative effort of 2 years of work, planning and building, 2 years of industrial effort, and the long march through the Pacific to take the bases from which the bombing of Japan could be accomplished. As we fly back late in the afternoon over these mountains which guard the approach to the Tokyo plains, this time we shall see they had only to look for Fujiyama, the one item on the Japanese landscape which could never be camouflaged, and it became a very useful guide to turn unerringly towards all their targets. And now, by way of a change from all this destruction, let's take a glimpse at a place which has not been bombed at all. This is the little hot spring town of Atami, about 3 hours' train drive from Tokyo. You are looking down upon a small township which is looking very much as it must have appeared through all the ages in Japan, with its little semi-cobbled streets, its shuttered houses, its dolly-like fronts, the only signs of war being the women wearing these mompai suits instead of their colored kimonos, and a few soldiers homing from the campaigns. We never bombed these small places. Our bombing was purely done to a strategic plan. It was never wanton, and wherever there was a town or a small city where there was nothing of any size to bomb, no strategic objectives, although it was frequently flown over and might have been used for the pinpointing of routes, nothing was ever dropped upon these places. Atami is a hot spring town. For Japan being very volcanic, there are many springs rising up through the earth, and the water is being pumped into hotels and even into bathrooms for many centuries. And many of these places have become fashionable resorts with a perpetual supply of hot water in bathrooms and bedrooms. It's quite the custom in Japan, in some of the great baths built in the hotels, for men, women and children to bathe together. It doesn't sound very hygienic, but it's really quite clean, for no one jumps into the great communal baths until he's been thoroughly soaped and scrubbed. This is done by attendants on the side of the bath, who after soaping you all over will throw little buckets of water over you till you're thoroughly clean. Then you plunge into the hot water which comes up to the neck, while a perpetual hot spring replenishes the water. Nobody soaps himself inside the bath. But the temperatures are very high, much higher than Europeans can normally stand, though the Japanese seem to delight in taking these baths at extremely high temperatures. The only other signs of war in a small township like this are the queues waiting for vegetables at the shops in these first months following the close of the conflict, when there's such a great shortage of food in Japan as there was in so many other parts of the world. In the countryside, the food situation is not quite so severe, for the peasants here, as elsewhere, can feed themselves first before allowing their surplus to reach the markets. But as the towns grow bigger in size and the problem of transportation becomes more complex, so the problem of feeding the people grows more difficult. We are going to leave Japan now for a while and journey across the Sea of Japan to the mysterious land of Korea, where visitors were rarely welcomed and photographers were never permitted to operate. We are going to cross over from Fukuoka, where the Japanese were arriving from Japan, and we are going to enter Korea, which the Japanese call Chosen, at the port of Pusan on the southern side of the country, facing the Sea of Japan. General Hodge, the American commander in Korea under MacArthur, was charged with the task of evacuating 1 million Japs and of bringing in the Koreans in their place, and of completing the job with some humanity, having regard to the women and children, and particularly the nursing mothers. His task was rendered somewhat difficult from the outset. The Japanese had been in possession of the country for something like 44 years. In that time they had stripped and plundered it, and they had suppressed the Korean language. They had not allowed the women to wear their national costume. No one could travel on the trains or the buses unless he could ask for what he wanted in Japanese. And in 44 years, the language of the country would have died out, had it not been for the fact that some Korean liberal professors, imprisoned for their political views, rewrote the Korean alphabet while they were in prison, brought it out with them when we liberated them, and the first generation of Korean children by 1946 began to relearn their mother tongue. The Koreans are rather a volatile people, split into large numbers of fragmentary parties. Only time can show whether they are capable of uniting and of forming a national government of their own. But in view of the way in which the Japanese had treated them, it was not to be wondered at that when Japanese rule broke down, and before we could reach the outer limits of their country, in many cases the Koreans fell on the Japanese, drove them out of their homes, burnt down their houses, drove them into the streets with little more than they stood up in. And in this condition the Japs began to walk through the countryside down to the port of Pusan to await evacuation. It helped to swell the numbers with which General Hodge could conveniently deal. And then the task was complicated somewhat by the Russians, who had declared war upon Japan just about 48 hours before the close of hostilities. By arrangement with the United States government at Washington, the Russians entered Korea and halted at the 38th parallel of latitude. The situation therefore has been, through the first years following the close of hostilities, that the Russians have been holding the northern part of Korea, north of the 38th parallel, where about 5 million Koreans live, and where all the industrial areas, the coal and the sources of hydroelectric power are to be found, while the Americans hold the southern part of Korea, where 17 million Koreans reside, and where the rich agricultural areas are to be found. General Hodge had full power to take decision on behalf of the United States in the interest of the Korean people. They'd like you to pay them a call. There was a scene being played on the set of a pilgrim marching through the mountains to worship at a Shinto shrine when he was set on by robbers. And these medieval knights are waiting out on the lawn for their cue to rush in and rescue him. Here's the funny man of the party. Some of the officers of the 8th Cavalry with the leading lady. She'll generally give you her autograph and a cup of tea if you call on her. And here are the callers in pink kimonos. Indeed, the first industry which seems to flourish in a country which has been bombed and invaded, and which has gone down for the count, is the entertainment industry. Hundreds of these people began to flock into our lines, offering to entertain the American troops. All they wanted in return, of course, was a good square meal of American rations, rather than payment in their own worthless paper money, for the yen was fixed at 15 to the dollar, or 60 to the pound sterling, only a quarter of its pre-war value. Every Japanese woman has very squat, ugly legs, which the kimono mercifully hides, and they wear an awful lot of sashes wrapped round their middle, which helps indeed to keep them warm. Here, every day, one sees familiar sights such as these round the Emperor's palace, where people come to bow to the Emperor. Soldiers coming home from the war, very often footsore and weary and hungry, thoroughly disillusioned with their political leaders and even perhaps their generals, yet they never include the Emperor, for the Emperor is God and above all suspicion. Women coming from their offices at midday for their lunch, with their little lacquer boxes, with their cooked rice, will pause here for a few moments for a sort of 2-minute silence to bow to the Emperor. Peasants coming up from the countryside, their greatest, most cherished ambition through their lives is to stand here by this bridge, where the Emperors cross from the palace to greet their people, and pause for 2 minutes in silence. Everybody bows to everybody throughout Japan. Indeed, we soon found that the Emperor's writ ran throughout the whole country, and we found we could rule through the Emperor and thereby run the country with a very small army of occupation. The Japanese have no word for surrender in their language, since they never surrendered previously in their history, or so they claim. They call it bowing to the enemy. It's not really difficult for us, at any rate in the British Empire, to understand this devotion of the people to the Emperor, for if in similar circumstances England had been invaded by Germany in this war, and the crown of England held in fee, I am sure the instinct of our people throughout the British Empire would have been to rally round the throne more closely, rather than desert it in its hour of anguish. Here it's expressed with more religious fervour. The children are usually brought at quite an early age to make their first obeisance at the Emperor's palace, and General MacArthur did nothing to interfere with all this ritual and ceremonial. The people were allowed to carry it out as much as they liked, as long as they behaved peacefully. There are some open-air gardens near the Emperor's palace, too, where the people can foregather to wait to go into the theatre, or where they can even hold open-air meetings. For one of MacArthur's first acts was to open up the prisons and empty them of all the political prisoners, and his second was to suppress the political police, or thought police, for even to harbour dangerous thoughts was considered a crime in Japan. You'll notice several of these people wearing masks over their faces. This is to keep out influenza germs. When the great wave of Spanish flu spread through the world in 1918 and 1919, after the First World War, a great many people in America took to wearing masks of this sort as a precaution, particularly on the Pacific coast, where lots of Japs resided. The Japs copied it, took it back to Japan. 28 years later, when we invade the country, we find the Japs still wearing these masks because they think the Americans are still doing so. The second great industry, which seems to flourish in a country which has been bombed in modern war and invaded, is the souvenir trade. This is the Ginza, the most famous shopping thoroughfare and the most fashionable street in Tokyo. But all the great emporiums are blitzed or closed or empty, and all the trade is reduced to curbside peddling. When we first came here in September 1945, one could purchase the beautiful flowered kimonos which used to take 8 months to make for as little as £4. Then G.I. Joe came in with his usual generous spending habits, and prices began to skyrocket, and the kimonos cost about £50 by the November. Indeed, at first the Japs began to remove their best silk and lacquer work and their kimonos to the hills and stored them away in remote villages, being afraid that the Allied troops were going to rape them and loot them and rob them. That was the only treatment they could understand the victor visiting upon the vanquished. It was the way they had treated the peoples of China and the Philippines. They couldn't understand it when G.I. Joe simply wished to be friendly, even to fraternize like this, and when he desired to buy what they had to sell and not rob them, and even to pay very good prices for it. It all seemed too good to be true, something the Japs had never experienced or treated other people with. But when they found it was so, confidence returned. They brought their silk and lacquer work down from the hills, but by the end of 1945 it had all gone. And then a thriving trade arose. Thousands of Japs were employed all over the country to supply the Ginza shopping center with souvenirs, as well, of course, as with utensils required by the population. But the Allied troops began to buy anything as long as it looked as if it was made in Japan. It made a very nice souvenir for the girlfriend at home in America, Australia, England, or New Zealand. But if any of the Japs were making fortunes out of this, they were only making it in their own worthless paper money. The yen had been fixed at 15 to the dollar or 60 to the pound sterling. No one was allowed to bring dollars or sterling into the country, so that unless a future Japanese government backs all these paper fortunes with their own gold or silver, it was money which could only be spent on products of Japan inside their own country. I said a few moments ago that we had conferred some sort of political liberty upon the Japs. Indeed, one of MacArthur's first aims was to introduce democracy to them, in the hope the tender seed would take root and grow. Even the communists were allowed out of jail. Some of them had spent 30 years there. They came down to Tokyo to make old friends again and start up their meetings once more. And now they've had their first popularly elected parliament. They've got a chance to make democracy a success if it's in their temperament to do so. Let us leave Tokyo for a while and journey in HMS Swiftsure of the British Pacific Fleet down to Kyushu, the southern of the 4 islands of the Japanese homeland. Kyushu, where 17 million Japs reside out of the 70 millions of them. We shall fly across the countryside for 20 minutes. You notice the hills are terraced. This is to grow cereals wherever any crops can be grown, to eke out the rice supply, which was never sufficient to feed the 70 millions of them. And so the Japs grow these cereals wherever any soil is to be found up the mountainsides. Our companion plane will wave its wings as a signal that it is going, and one frequently sees in Japan a small child with a little doll on its back in the same fashion, which is rather pathetic because it can't get at the doll to play with it. But in this case, one sees a woman with a very small infant, perhaps less than a year old. It can't support its head on its shoulders. Its head is hanging down its back like a trussed chicken. It's quite a common sight in Japan. One feels rather sorry for the infants carried in this way, often exposed to the glare of the sun, which may account for the fact that so many Japs develop weak eyesight early in life. In the city we discovered a number of steel safes, rusty but intact, and thereby hangs a tale. For at the time of the 1923 earthquake, when Yokohama and Tokyo were devastated, the insurance companies refused to pay out unless policies were produced. But of course they'd been burnt. An enterprising American went over when the cities were rebuilt, selling insurance policies with safes. The safes sold like hot cakes all over the country, but this time it's the insurance companies which have been blitzed. So the poor Japs had it both going and coming. In one large building here which we entered, we discovered a girls' school with hundreds of schoolgirls. and many of them on the roof, dressed in a uniform with a navy motif running through the tunic, for they were very proud of their navy and were constantly having propaganda about it preached to them. I tried to get the girls to smile to us. They were rather frightened at first. They were not quite sure what it was we were after. But after a few grimaces, in which they must have thought I looked rather amusing to them, they burst into laughter, and one sees them giggling like schoolgirls the world over. They look very healthy, actually, but in reality they're all down to less than half rations, and had been for the previous 2 years. In good times, the Japs eat the equivalent of some 5 cups of rice per day. Well, now for the last 2 years they've been down to 2 cups of rice per day. One of General MacArthur's first acts was to import fertilizers to enable a bumper rice crop to be gathered in the following year, in the hope that their rations might return to full strength so that they could work better in the mines and at the factories, the general aim being to make the people self-supporting so that the Allies would not have to keep them as we had to do in Germany. Since the loss of the rice in Korea and Formosa, now that those territories have gone back to their original owners, the feeding of the people off their own resources is all the more necessary. Let's take a look round Kagoshima from the top of this school, and we see how over 50% of this city has been destroyed, just like Nagasaki, but this time not by the atomic bomb, but by the cumulative effect of hundreds of bombers raiding this city like others from distant Guam and Saipan in the Marianas. Finally, I tried to get the girls to give us the ceremonial bow. Everybody bows to everybody in Japan, usually with a hissing noise as they draw in their breath, because it's considered impolite to breathe on the person with whom one's conversing. Some of the American Marines taught these girls in some of these towns that when a general or an admiral entered a lift and they bowed to him, they were to say at the same time, "Oh, my aching back." The boys are in more cheerful mood. Their school's being taken over by the military authorities, so it means no more school for them for some time. Indeed, we found the children in Japan quite engaging. The common experience was, as always, you cannot take the war out of the children. The grown-ups generally stayed indoors when we first entered a town for the first 3 or 4 days, being very frightened and half ashamed of being invaded. It was the children who first allowed their curiosity to overcome their fear. The little boys would run out of the houses calling out, "Hello, goodbye." That was the first English they learned. And the little girls would line the streets, bowing gravely at every jeep that went by, feeling quite sure the Emperor himself would be on board. In production and distribution of war material, so that it would pile up in each of these islands and could not reach the ports to leave for those parts of the war where we had to face the Japs in the outer islands. There's a hotel here where the people still leave Japanese style, where you see the women now wearing again a lovely flowered kimono. It's the custom in Japan for a woman always to wait up for her husband, no matter how late he comes in or what small hours of the morning. She wouldn't dream of going to bed till he's home. She meets him at the door with his slippers, bows low to the ground to him, and asks no questions. There's a very nice 17th century country house here also which we visited. It's customary to remove the shoes first before entering these houses. The floors are covered with lovely white rice mats, which are 1/2 an inch thick and 6 foot by 3. And the size of a Japanese room is known by the number of mats required to cover the floor completely, not by the number of feet or yards square. Flying back from Kagoshima to the base at Sasebo, from where we've started this tour around Kyushu, one sees something of the damage done to Sasebo itself. A port set amid the hills, where a good deal of war material was stored away and burrowed into those hills, safe from bombers. All the lighter portions of the city near the docks have been blitzed and destroyed. The darker portions, with the traditional slate-grey roof which Japanese houses affect, have so far escaped destruction. From Sasebo we shall fly across country to the northern side of Kyushu, to the port of Fukuoka, facing the Sea of Japan. Fukuoka is the port from where the Koreans leave Japan to return to their own country, and the port to which 1 million Japanese, evacuated in a great exodus movement from Korea, return to their homeland after their 44 years of misrule in the land they called Chosen. Fukuoka presents us with the best picture of the way in which the petroleum jelly bombs have burnt out vast areas of the city. Here we shall see how the docks, the harbours, the warehouses, the business sector, the factories, all the areas associated with the production of munitions of war have been systematically burnt out. When therefore he has communicated with the Russian general north of the 38th parallel, offering to exchange the harvest of the south, which the people of the north badly need, for the industrial resources of the north, particularly the coal, which is just as urgently required in the south, and for the railways in Japan, the Russian general has not had the same power to take immediate decisions, but has had to transmit these requests to Moscow. And under the Soviet method of government, all such matters have had to be settled on the highest level in government circles at Moscow itself. This of necessity has caused delays and has prevented that unification of the north and south zones of Korea in these first years of the peace. And it also resulted in the Korean people accusing both sides of dividing their country up between them instead of granting to them the promised independence. The situation was complicated still further by yet another factor. As the war ended, thousands of the American troops who had served for many years in trying climates in the Pacific not unnaturally desired to return to their homes. All the shipping, therefore, which was immediately available at the close of the war was earmarked for the priority task of taking the troops home on leave and of bringing out replacements. The Koreans, who had been dragooned by the Japanese to work in the mines of Japan, because they could not altogether be trusted to serve as fighting soldiers at the front, were so used in order that Japanese working in the mines could be released to become soldiers. Not unnaturally, therefore, with the close of hostilities and the prospect of their own country being returned to them, the Koreans clamored to leave the mines in Japan and return to their own country. But thousands of Japanese miners lay as prisoners of war upon the hands of the Allies in all the islands of the Pacific. They could not be brought back to Japan in order to operate the mines and relieve the Koreans, because the shipping was not available in the first year or two of the peace for the task. These then were some of the complications which beset General MacArthur in Japan and his subordinate General Hodge in Korea. How to placate the Koreans and give them their independence and their unification. How to take home the thousands of troops who desired to return home after long years of the war. How to keep the mines in Korea and Japan going. How to provide the people of the north of Korea with their food from the south and secure the coal from the north for the south in return. How to relieve the mines in Japan of Koreans without losing the precious coal production in Japan, while Japanese miners lay as prisoners of war a long way home. It naturally took a very long time following the close of the war for all these problems to be satisfactorily sorted out. Meanwhile, down at Fusan, we find crabbed age and youth, women and children, assembled together, waiting to leave Korea and return to their own country. In many cases, they are to receive their first glimpse of Japan. In others, they have served many years away from their home country, and they are leaving a land which has not known the war, returning to one completely blitzed, of which fact at this moment they are still in complete ignorance. Here too we shall see the Korean women, once again back in their own national costume, acting as nurses and orderlies among the Japanese women. For the Japanese women were stripped and examined under cover in the sheds at the warehouses, while the men were examined in the open. And at the end of this scene are a few amusing pictures as we watch the Japanese being... The only city of any size in all Japan which has not been damaged by bombing is Kyoto, the ancient university capital of the South. It was quite a joy to come to a city where the railway station was intact where there were no panes of broken glass strewn about the streets, where shopping was fairly normal, though here again one sees the same interminable crowd of people carrying immense bundles of all their worldly possessions as they travel about the country in search of friends and relatives. Kyoto is the ancient university capital, and as there were no munition factories here, we never bombed it at all. Up to about the 12th century, Japan was divided into a number of provinces called shogunates, of which the principal ones in the south were grouped round Kyoto with their own emperor, while those in the north were grouped round Tokyo with the family of Hirohito on the throne. In the 12th century there was a war between north and south, a war which the north won. All the shogunates were amalgamated in the family of Hirohito, and Japan began to know a national unity which was to develop into that aggressive military nationalism of the 19th century which inevitably led to war. Kyoto is a place of many lovely pagodas and shrines of different faiths. Let us pay a visit to one of the loveliest Shinto shrines in all Japan, with its torii or gateway in lacquered columns, and peeping through in the distance we can see the lovely shrine with its lacquered columns and its copper-green roof, flanked on either side by a similar building, giving a pleasing picture of symmetry to the whole. While in the courtyard are little fonts where the people will wash the dust from their faces and hands before they approach the shrine. These shrines are not exactly churches for long religious services, except perhaps on festival occasions. They are erected to the memory of some ancestor. The Japanese keep up Sunday as their weekly day of rest. This is a Sunday, and so one sees rather more people at the shrines on Sunday than normally. Here you will see a man and his wife approaching the shrine, or a crocodile of school children, or a grandmother bringing a small child at the christening stage, or some Red Cross nurses, or a string of children also with their grandparents. They come to the shrine to attract the attention of the ancestor with whom they would converse. Perhaps they would clap their hands to attract his attention, or hang up notes amid the tinkling bells. They say a prayer, bow at the shrine, perhaps cast some money, some yen or sen, into the box for the upkeep of the shrines, and then continue on their journey. It's quite the custom for a small child to be brought here at what we would call the christening stage, usually by the grandmother on both sides of the family, in which the infant is generally dressed in the gorgeous kimono the family can afford to make its first obeisance at the Shinto shrine, while in other cases whole numbers of children are brought by the grandparents at a little later stage to learn their prayers and the ritual to be observed here. In the Shinto faith, the Japanese believe that the emperor is veritably God, that they are descended from gods. They believe in the worship of their ancestors, and that when they die they must appear before the court of their ancestors to account for their conduct in this life. The Japanese militarists throughout the 19th century seized upon the best facets of Shintoism as of everything else and began to exploit it for militaristic ends. They taught generations of young men, for instance, that the finest thing they could do in this world was to die for the emperor in battle, and if they did so, they could then appear directly before the court of their ancestors, who would be very pleased with them. And that conversely, the worst thing they could do in this life was to surrender in battle to the enemy, particularly to the hated white man, whom they regarded as their inferior, but to do so would incur the intense displeasure of their ancestors. And they reinforced this argument by teaching them also that if they did surrender, they could never return to Japan. Their names would be struck off the nominal rolls of their regiments, their wives treated as widows. In fact, they sold this doctrine so well that we took very few prisoners throughout the campaigns. These little girls are wearing a patch on their pockets. This is the civilian's identity disc. The soldier wears it on his wrist, and after death in battle, the hand is chopped off at the wrist, is sent back to Japan and cremated, and is usually given to the relatives in a white box, white being the color of mourning, at some ceremonial parade attended by a member of the emperor's family. General MacArthur cut off the Shinto church from the state, and here are the Shinto priests who now live entirely by voluntary contributions. Let us visit Hiroshima for the last time, past that sunken cruiser in the inland sea, this time we journey by train and by road, and secure a close-up of the damage we had previously seen from the air. There are many Christian churches here, as at Nagasaki. In fact, one of the tragedies there was the fact that there were 10,000 Catholics among the Japanese, of whom 8,000 were killed by the bomb. But the other 2,000 came into our lines to tell us how they had kept the faith through all the difficult years. If we climb to the roof of the city hall, which has survived, we can secure a panorama for 12 miles in every direction and survey the damage. And as we see how this one bomb accomplished so much destruction when dropped from one aeroplane on one visit, it teaches us the shape of things to come. Indeed, through all the military colleges of the Allied powers from 1946 onwards, the implications of the atomic bomb and its effect on future strategy and tactics have been closely studied. For England, it has taught one overriding lesson, for with the coming of atomic warfare and of the use of guided missiles, the British Isles are more vulnerable in relation to Europe than ever before. It has taught the old axiom of warfare that the base must first be made safe before operations can be conducted from it. And just as the Royal Air Force Fighter Command in the Battle of Britain over the English Channel in the summer months of the year 1940 saved England from invasion and saved the world by gaining the necessary time through the deflection of the German air attack upon Britain, so in future war, the study of the methods of deflecting atomic bomb attacks upon the British Isles is the first consideration, compared with which the building of the bombs for use against other countries becomes a luxury. For unless the British Isles, the base, are safe, future warfare against an aggressor in Europe becomes impossible, for the base itself might fall. Therefore, the saving of the base is still the first principle of strategy, which neither the coming of newer weapons of war nor the quickening of the tempo of conflict in any way alter. This is the overriding lesson, and this is the way in which British scientists are first tackling the task in those first post-war years after the war of 1945. And so we fly back to Tokyo for the last time, this time in deep December, with mighty Fuji now completely snowbound, looking very much like some great Christmas pudding completely overflowing with sauce. It's not really difficult to understand why Fuji is so sacred to the Japanese, for when the wintry winds blow down from Manchuria and Siberia and through Korea across Japan, they swirl round the mountain, carrying their Arctic breath to every dweller of the plains, as if whispering a personal message to each that winter is at hand. And so our picture and story close with this sunset over Japan, a symbolic sunset, a long, deep sunset over the fallen empire of the rising sun.